Does the climate crisis get you anxious? Yeah, me too. I want to fix it, so I'm going to do what I do best. Report on what's going on and build a news organization that does it well. Hi, I'm Mike Fourcher, a reporter based in Chicago. I've covered politics, business, farming, and I've launched, operated, and sold multiple news operations. But before all that, I worked in Washington, D.C. for 2 different U.S. energy secretaries, where, among other things, I worked on climate and energy issues. Now I need your help to combine those 2 interests, reporting and climate, to help explain the United Nations global climate negotiations. And I already started my research. Last month I sent a survey to thousands of negotiations attendees, and what I heard back was they don't think there's enough detailed reporting on the meetings. There's big things happening at the UN that people need to know more about. Debating a date to wean off fossil fuels for good. World leaders are calling to distribute hundreds of billions of aid to convert countries to green economies. There's even talk of creating a new global commodity, carbon credits, that could be traded and sold around the world by anyone, even you. To cover all this, I want to go to this year's United Nations negotiations meeting in Dubai from November 30th to December 12th, and maybe to some other meetings around the world. Starting in November, I'll report on negotiations and publish a daily newsletter for supporters, but I'm also going to meet with as many negotiators and climate advocates as possible so I can build a long-term business plan. I want to start a news organization that details what's going on to fix the world's climate. Contribute to my Kickstarter, send me to Dubai this fall, and let's shed some light on climate negotiations.
This is the Cole Memo. I am your host, Cole Preston. Every episode is released in audio, video, and transcript format. To find the transcript, audio, or video version of any episode, please refer to the description of the episode that you're listening to now. Within that description, you can find a link that will take you to our website, which will display the transcript for this episode and the platforms where you can find this episode in audio or video formats. If you're unable to locate the episode description on whichever platform you're listening from, simply note the episode number and visit thecolememo.com. You can find the corresponding episode, and then you'll be able to access the audio, video, and transcript versions of that episode. You might also find any links that we reference during the episode so that you might be able to do your own research. If you're not listening to this episode of The Cole Memo on Patreon, then you're listening to this episode later than our patrons. To become a patron, go to thecolememo.com/Patreon. Once again, that's thecolememo.com/PATREON. It's a great way to support our show. One of the best ways to support our show is free. Leave us a positive review from wherever you're listening to us from. Favorite this episode, give it a thumbs up, leave a comment, or post a review. Your engagement and support is appreciated. In this episode, I speak to Mike Fourcher. If you'd like to support Mike's Kickstarter, just go to gettingwarmer.co. Once again, that's gettingwarmer.co. Enjoy this episode of The Cole Memo. Well, Mike, welcome to the Cole Memo.
Hey, it's great to be here.
Pleasure to speak with you. For those that aren't aware of who you are, do you mind giving a little bit of an introduction on the outset of this conversation?
Who am I? I am a political and business reporter, journalist based in Chicago. I've been doing reporting for about 12, 15 years. Before that, I worked in politics for a long time, including I started my career in Washington, D.C. And part of the time that I was there, I was heading up policy at the U.S. Department of Energy. Well, not heading up, but being one of the leaders of policy at U.S. Department of Energy, which led to my interest now. Part of what I did way back in the 90s and the early aughts was working on climate and energy efficiency and those kind of things, when everyone thought that it was something that was going to be really important a long time from then. And hey, look, it's over 20 years later and it's important now. So yeah,
Yeah.
that's me.
Thank you again for joining me today. And it's heatrising.net. That's the new beat, right?
That's my home for the moment. Yeah, I've been keeping a blog, newsletter, Substack, whatever you want to call it, writing about climate issues while I'm working on a bigger project, which is to cover climate negotiations starting this November and December in Dubai. And I have this larger project and concept that, and here's my Kickstarter. You can get to the Kickstarter through through Heat Rising, but also gettingwarmer.co will direct you to that too. And the concept of the Kickstarter is to send me to Dubai, and then you get a whole bunch of daily reports on what's actually happening, along with pictures. And if I can get some video interviews too, that would be really cool. There's a lot going on with climate negotiations that is just not covered, not talked about, that's going to change our world in a big way, probably very soon.
Yeah. And hey, what do you think? You want to dive into it? I know they've not happened yet, but I talked to you before air and beforehand, and I thought it'd be interesting to tell people, what are these climate negotiations? What's the history of them?
So there, for the last, this is now the number 28 that they're going to. They number them, and so 28 years every year. The 198 parties, so they're not just countries. So like the Vatican has a representative that's there too. 198 parties have been going and meeting and talking about how to deal with climate change. And that, that's a huge, huge topic. And because it's this body of all of the countries of the world, they can do pretty much anything they want if everybody agrees on it. And the everybody agrees on it part is the really hard thing. But they talk about things like setting standards for each country. How much carbon emissions are we supposed to be putting out, which is the really big story. And every country is supposed to set a goal in order to get us to net zero, so zero carbon emissions. The idea is that we want to keep the Earth from warming less than 1.5 degrees Celsius, which doesn't sound like very much. Right now, we're at about 1.2 degrees Celsius, but that amount has already really started to impact our world. We see this summer, the Gulf was at 100 degrees. Like, you get in the water and it's 100 degrees all the time. We've had bigger hurricanes. We've had lots more floods. There's been droughts in all kinds of places. Huge, huge heat waves. Most of Southern Europe was in a giant heat wave. Fires going across Greece. The fires in Canada. All of these things are traced directly to climate change. One of the things that's an immediate economic impact is that Florida, Louisiana, Texas, these places are now losing insurers because the insurers say there's too much chance of wind and water damage, so we don't want to insure your home. So now something like 10-15% of people in Florida don't have home insurance. So if there's a hurricane, they lose everything. And home insurance in Florida and in Texas is skyrocketing. There are people in Florida that are paying something like $8,000 a year just in home insurance. I mean, that's a big nut. If you have a home that's $300,000, worth $300,000, and you're paying $8,000 a year, wow, man. I mean, that's a lot of money. That's like 3-4% of your of the value of your home every year. So this sort of thing is getting worse and worse and worse. And the climate negotiations are really the only place to address all of this. And some of the things that they're talking about are, one, setting limits for the amount of carbon that we put out, but the other is setting an end date for the use of fossil fuels. So like no more fossil fuels, no more coal, no more gasoline, no more natural gas. Another is talking about sending hundreds, maybe trillions of dollars to developing countries so that they can build green economies. They don't have enough money for it, which would probably come out of our wallets. And this other really kind of amazing idea, which I don't think anybody has really thought through how big a change it would be, is creating essentially a whole new global currency. And that would be carbon credits. And the reason I say it would be a currency is that the idea that we're moving towards is that no matter where you are in the world, a unit of carbon would be worth the same. So you, me, large institutions, whoever, we might trade carbon credits among each other, which is a really kind of wild idea. And nobody really knows how that would work. They know that they need to make it work because in order to be able to make it so that people want to reduce the amount of carbon that they're putting out, you have to put some value on it. So it costs somebody something. How do you decide to do that? And we're really heading into this. I mean, I honestly think it's such a big, giant idea. It's almost impossible for us to wrap our brains around. It's like, what would happen if tomorrow everyone could fly? And, well, yeah, that'd be fun. But then would you need a car? I mean, how do you get places? And so the idea of a global currency or something that's tradable around the world, I can't even begin to imagine what all the changes would result. And so that is what we're talking about here at these climate negotiations, ways in which our world is going to change in a just massive, massive way very soon. And, in the next 15 years, probably.
Yeah. The carbon standard. It reminds me of the gold standard almost.
Yeah. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, gold is tradable around the world and it has value for everybody. But the problem with gold is that it's so big and heavy, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can't carry around gold bars very easily. But a carbon credit would be digital. You would potentially be able to carry it in your phone or in some sort of account somewhere, like a Bitcoin wallet. And that would be a very real thing. We would, I think that the potential of change in our world because of that is just enormous.
Yeah. So it looks like this is called COP28. Is that correct?
COP28, Conference of the Parties.
Of the parties.
Yeah, they love their acronyms at the UN. There are so many. They toss around acronyms all the time. It's like the military,
Mm-hmm.
except not.
Sure. Sure.
It's like if the military became a bunch of peaceniks.
Right.
And so it's going to be in the UAE, the
United Arab
United
Emirates.
Arab Emirates. Wow, I can't believe I forgot that. So in Dubai,
Yeah.
And it's ironic that it's going to be in Dubai because Dubai is basically just one big carbon spewing place. You can't live there without a ton of air conditioning, and it's not a walkable city. It's all these huge 10-lane expressways everywhere.
And it's literally, I know that all cities are man-made, but this is like a city that's made where, am I wrong? It's not really inhabitable.
Yeah, it's on the ocean, but it's not like a pleasant part of the ocean.
Right.
It's basically just sand and rock that just encounter water. And it's not like there's trees and stuff like that. It's just desert. And so we're going to a place which really shouldn't exist and is a huge carbon spewing location in order to talk about spewing less carbon in the air. And there's ironies of ironies abound. It's whack.
Yeah. And before we talk about maybe some of the things you're anticipating or looking forward to with this year, the potential of going there in mid-November, could you maybe give us a history of how these things have gone in the past? And we can start before the last president. The last president is why I am familiar with these talks, because am I wrong in thinking that we like backed out of those talks as a nation or something
Not
like
the
that?
talks, but the big agreement, which is called the Paris Agreement.
Mm,
So there had been a series of agreements which had come to really, there was a lot of talk for the first 10, 12 years. There was basically disagreement about what exactly is damaging and how much climate change is really bad, and is there really climate change. There was a lot of fighting about that. And right around 2012, 2013, there became a scientific consensus. There was a scientific consensus, but it became very clear. Here's the work that shows 99% of the world's scientists said there's climate change, it's really bad, and it's coming. And then there was the idea about, well, how do we decide exactly what limit do we have in order to stop climate change? Because a long time it was like, oh, well, maybe if we get to 4 degrees above the average temperature, we'll be okay. And in 2015, there was what was called the Paris Agreement, because you had COP, I can't remember what it was, COP 18 or something like that, that was in Paris. And they came to the agreement at this, or most of the countries of the world came to the agreement that we need to be below 2 degrees centigrade, preferably below 1.5. 2 degrees, true disaster, like polar ice caps will melt, everything will go bad. 1.5, pretty bad, maybe a lot of that. We're not really exactly sure how much, but in that half degree, things are pretty bad. And most of the world agreed to this thing that we were all going to get together and we're going to work on setting benchmarks for each of our countries on how much carbon we're going to stop, and we're going to work towards certainly having net zero by 2050, earlier if we can. And every country agreed to do what they said was a global stock take, where they'd set numbers to achieve, and then every 5 years they'd look at how they're doing. They take stock, so global stock take. And this year, by the way, is going to be the first stock take report. And the United States signed the treaty and said that they're going to do it under President Obama in 2016. And then as soon as Donald Trump became president, one of the first things he did was say, the United States is not going to adhere to the Paris Agreement. We don't agree with any of that. Climate change is, hokum. And the world kind of lost its mind, and everyone decided, well, we're just going to go on without the United States, and we're going to try and do everything we can. So the problem with that is that the world's largest polluters in historical sense is the United States, then the European Union, then China, then India. Now, the current biggest polluters, like every year, the order has changed. So it's now China, the United States, India, the EU. So the EU has really reduced its polluting. The United States has leveled off its polluting, but China's polluting has just skyrocketed. And India as well. And there's a lot of interesting reasons behind that. We can talk later. But basically, the United States said, we're not going to be part of this, and stopped doing anything. While China, although they are polluting more, they actually also have the biggest renewable energy projects in the world. They're far ahead of everybody, and it's because their economy has been growing so much, and they're over 1 billion people. They've actually, to a certain extent, kept a lid on their pollution with the amount of renewable energy projects, and they have the biggest electric car production in the world by far. I mean, Tesla is like 1/10 of the world production, and the rest of it is all Chinese companies. 1/3 of all cars in China are now electric that are being sold on an annual basis, which is an amazing amount. And all that happened because the United States got out of the game for about 4 years. And then as soon as Biden came back, he said, we are going to be part of the Paris Agreement. And then the various things passed, including the Inflation Reduction Act, which is not about inflation reduction, but is actually about creating a new green economy. So, it's hard to track all this because there are so many different things. We're actually watching our national and global economy and probably way of life changing very fast in lots of very complicated ways. And that's a large part of what I want to be reporting on with the climate negotiations, because I see that as the center of where all these changes are coming.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's one question I wanted to wrap back around to at the beginning that we kind of touched on and you just kind of touched on again. But yeah, why are you covering these topics? I feel like through talking about it, it makes itself self-apparent why you're talking about these issues.
Yeah. Well, first off, I think that everybody in the world needs to know more about this. I think we tend to not pay attention to it because it's the UN and everyone knows the UN is boring, and it is. I mean, if you sit in on the meetings, if you watch the meetings, if you read the stuff about it, it's boring. God, it's not nearly as fun as a lot of other things. But the truth is that the impact that it's going to have on us is colossal. And the idea that just because we're the United States, we can do anything we want is really slipping away. If you look at some of the negotiation points, some of the things that the world is talking about, we're ending up in a place where not just a majority, but almost everyone in the world is agreeing to certain things, except for the United States and Europe and China. So, one of the things that the world agrees on is that we need to have a fund to help developing countries deal with all of the damage that's being done that they can't pay for. So rising tides, there are whole countries that are about to disappear. The country of Tuvalu, I know it doesn't sound very big, it's less than 1 million people, but they have started buying land in other countries so that when the water in Tuvalu rises, they have a place to go because they anticipate that their island nation is going to disappear. This sort of thing is happening a lot. The Philippines has become a major leader in climate change negotiations because they anticipate that a large part of the Philippines is just going to get washed over with water from the rising oceans. There are parts of Africa that are just now heading into permanent drought because the rains just don't come anymore. There are parts of Europe that are doing that. They anticipate less wine production in France. This year, the cost of olive oil has quadrupled because Spain and Greece have not been able to produce as much olives as they have in the past because of the heat. So these things are really starting to impress the rest of the world, and the United States can't keep resisting. And I think that it's important for Americans and others in the West to be able to understand this story in the context of it all. We can't keep looking just at home and burying our head underwater or under the sand all the time, because it's coming to get us.
Yeah. Yeah. And just to get back to, thank you for addressing while you're covering this, just to get back to the negotiations, I'm just curious, in the past, if you've watched, it sounds like you have been watching, and kind of keeping track of these over the years. You mentioned that before 2012, there wasn't really a consensus that this was caused by, as man-made climate change, uh,
Well, let's say there wasn't a political consensus.
political consensus.
There was a scientific consensus,
True.
and the resistance largely came from oil producing and the major oil consumers. And so the OPEC nations, led by Saudi Arabia and Russia and the United States and Canada, pushed very, very, very hard back against the idea that climate change was something that was coming soon. It was always the idea, well, it'll come sometime in the far future. But we don't have to worry about it right now. We'll get to it when we get to it. The scientists were jumping up and down and saying, oh, no, 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 this is a real problem. And in fact, there's stories coming out now. For instance, it turns out ExxonMobil, way back in the 1980s, had an internal scientific report that said that climate change is real and it is going to be doing damage, and it's because of the stuff that we're pulling out of the ground. So,
I was
people
about to
have,
say I wouldn't be surprised if they had like a Philip Morris-esque, like, how Philip Morris had similar, they had like scientific studies where they knew,
yeah, oh yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, that we now know that. I mean, that is public. The oil companies have known that what they're doing is damaging, and you still have countries like Saudi Arabia and UAE, who is hosting this year's talks, that have been resisting. The United States is one of the major resistors and has been consistently. One of the really fascinating things about these climate talks is that it used to be that around 5,000 or 6,000 people would go, which is a good sized number, but you can sort of imagine that in like a little conference area. Now you're getting 40,000 that are registered, but there's tens of thousands of more people that are sort of in these side meetings and all this other stuff that's going on. And those meetings are attracting a lot of people from oil companies and financial companies that have a lot at stake with energy. And those people are there to push back. They lobby. They're there to push against the idea of dealing with climate change. Now, there's lots of activist groups that are there too. Greenpeace has a huge presence. World Wildlife Fund has a huge presence. So there's a lot of those groups that are there, but they don't have as nice parties, and they don't have as much high end booze. So
you mean money, right?
Yeah. So that there is a certain imbalance. Yet at the same time, for a lot of these developing nations are really not interested in what the oil companies have to say, because climate change is a clear and present danger for them. And it's becoming increasingly so for the United States. I mean, like I was talking about with Florida, this is a real thing that is happening to us now, not sometime in the future.
Yeah, very well said. So what was it like before there was political consensus at these? I know you mentioned this. Is this your first one that you would attend?
It's my first one, but I used to get pretty regular briefings, because the Department of Energy, it was folks from my office that went and were the technical representatives. Actually, the main negotiator from Department of Energy, had his office next to mine, and I would get their readouts. And what was discussed was how fast things are going, and whether or not it's something that's a real danger sometime in the near future. And that was kind of a ridiculous conversation because
Right.
rather than dealing with, okay, well, here's a problem, the question is, well, how long can we wait before we have to deal with this? And, at the time, it just seemed like, oh yeah, this is bad. Oh well. There were a lot of other things that seemed a lot more present, like, how are we going to be able to make sure that everybody's homes are heated with heating oil? We weren't really comprehending that there was a necessary change in how our world works, and things were really nascent. I mean, I actually went at Argonne National Laboratories here in Illinois. I went on a tour of the lab with Energy Secretary Federico Pena, and they had been at Argonne developing regenerative brakes. So, regenerative brakes in cars so that when you brake, it takes the energy and puts it back into a battery. And, we drove in one of the first regenerative braking cars. I think it was a Ford Escort that they had modified. And, so this was in 1999. That was a brand new idea. And now these sort of things, you can go buy, you buy an EV, it has regenerative brakes. They all have them. Toyota Priuses have had them for a long time.
Right.
So there was a lot of technology that we were talking about that is now really coming to fruition. Solar at around 2000, was considerably more expensive technology. Really only rich people could conceive having solar panels on their house. And even then, it wouldn't necessarily really defray the cost. It was more kind of a virtue signaling more than anything else. And now it's cheap. If you can put the money up front, you're going to make back the money on solar for your house in probably less than 10 years. And, then you're making money. You basically have free electricity. If you're buying a house and you can put up another $10,000-12,000 in order to put solar on top of your house, by the time you've had it for half your mortgage period, you're going to be making a lot of money. That's a big change, and I think that sort of thing now, in the world that we live in, we can do something about it. Whereas back then it was sort of like, I don't know, we can't really get rid of gas cars. Like electric cars seemed really far in the future.
Right. People would make jokes like, oh, it's going to die before you leave the parking lot, the car.
Yeah, right. Right. They didn't really exist,
Yeah. Yeah. And the reason I asked that question is because I got the impression that without political consensus, that maybe we were just like tripping over ourselves. And it sounds like maybe that was accurate, where you were saying like, well, we're not having a conversation of what we need to do, but when we need to do it, and stuff like that, And I guess,
I think.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. Well, I think the people who are climate advocates would say that the problem that we had 20 years ago was a lack of imagination, and that we probably could have sped up the development of these technologies a lot if there was a big pot of money that was put into it. If the federal government said, this is a priority and here's what we're going to do. But I don't think that even if you got 3 super rich people together and piled their money together, that would have been enough resources in order to, fix everything, or make the technology work. I mean, we did have a technology problem that probably could have been sped up by 10 years, maybe 15. But, again, we're a lot of the issues with climate change is about human ability to imagine something different. It's hard for us to imagine that we can have electric cars everywhere. It's hard for us to imagine what life will be with electric cars. I mean, like, one of the things that I was talking about with somebody is, where are you going to go buy your cigarettes? Well, a lot of people, when they go buy their cigarettes, they buy it at a gas station. They buy it at a gas station when they go, get a gallon, a few gallons of gas. And I don't know, is that what you do? And what happens if you don't need to go to a gas station? What happens to gas stations? And how are people going to charge up? I mean, there was a story in the Chicago Sun-Times the other day about a parking lot that's downtown that's going to put in conjunction with the big local utility, ComEd, they're going to put in 300 more charging stations in that parking lot. So, who's going to be making that money? Is it going to be parking lots? Are parking lots all of a sudden going to be making money? Are utilities going to be making money? Are we going to see a place to go buy cigarettes in a parking lot? Like what happens? And there's so many changes that I think that are going to come as a result of the new technologies and the way that we need to live differently, that we just can't comprehend how different it is. Like, I mean, this thing, my phone, has changed my life in so many ways, and I can't imagine going back to what it is. I love to read books about the 1970s because everything seems so quiet.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that we're going to see some real changes. And I think that, back then in the 90s and the early aughts, we just didn't have the capacity to imagine how our world could change or would change as a result of climate change.
Yeah. Yeah, like you say, I couldn't imagine not having a phone. I'm about to do like a trip to one of my first trips to DC actually.
Mm-hmm.
And I wouldn't be able to find my way if I didn't have my phone to tell me every turn of the way. Like
Yeah.
forget getting a physical map out. Like I
Yeah.
was not born in that generation.
Yeah. Google Maps has really changed. You can take public transit anywhere.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Like,
true.
you go to a place where you don't speak the language and Google Maps will tell you where to go. You don't have to, I mean, that's an incredibly hopeful thing, it makes you want to feel comfortable with going and doing new things. So I think that we're really, the problem with climate change we have is less about technology, certainly now, less about technology and more about human capacity to imagine the differences and how we do things differently. And that's a large part of what I want to be able to cover and talk about. In these negotiations, we're talking about really revolutionary changes to our world in parts of the world that want to change those things. And when you say climate change, revolutionary changes, the immediate thought that everybody has is, oh, well, we're going to have carbon limits and stuff like that. Yeah, but we're going to have things like, if everyone has solar, or if a lot of people have solar, do you really need a utility anymore? And that's a big change in your life. What do utilities do? Where are you going to go if you have an electric car? You don't have to go to a gas station anymore. What happens to all the gas stations? What happens to the auto mechanics?
What happens to the towns? One of the things I noticed when I would travel through Nevada, there was a lot of ghost towns. And what I learned, it was because of the increased fuel efficiency of cars, that the
Oh,
towns in
wow.
between,
Yeah.
nobody stopped to get gas anymore. So the town
Yeah.
just died.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I used to travel in West Virginia a lot. And in West Virginia, a lot of times, and in a lot of rural places, the one business that a town will have that is local is an auto mechanic.
Yep.
So, because you have to have a local auto mechanic, right? And so what happens? I think those things are really, really major changes and that we just can't imagine. I mean, this fight with the UAW is about the fact that it takes a lot fewer people to put together an EV than it does to put together an internal combustion engine. You don't need spark plugs, you don't need crankshafts, you don't need transmissions, you don't need fuel injection. there's all these hundreds and hundreds of pieces of assembly that aren't necessary. But there are a different set of jobs, but this is all changing to a different place. So, our world
Yeah.
is getting ready for a pretty big shift. And I'm not sure that we've really comprehended how much of a change it's going to be for all of us.
Wanted to add a different layer to this, but one of the things I'm thinking of right now, when you think of people can't imagine, I'm sure when the light bulb first came out, people were like, well, hold on a second. I light the torches every night. What the hell is going to happen to my job? And it's like, well, so now we replace the light bulbs, right? Or
I actually, to go a little further,
sure.
at the time, it was very expensive to have oil, or it was very expensive to have gas lamps, or very dirty, and you didn't want to have a lot of them because it would get too dirty. You would have smoke everywhere, and the inexpensiveness and the convenience of an electric light bulb changed how people would spend their day.
Yeah.
Now, when the sun goes down, you could still do stuff, and so all of a sudden you had this nightlife. And nightlife didn't necessarily mean staying out and drinking. It meant
Right.
maybe you would read,
Right.
maybe you would get together with your friends and just hang out and talk, or your family.
Mm-hmm.
There was this expansion of leisure time that came as a result of the light bulb. We couldn't imagine that.
Yeah.
And so I think that we're really on the edge of some major societal changes that we just can't imagine. And all of this is going to come out of the climate negotiations. This is the nexus. And I think that we're not, as a people, really completely anticipating all the change. I keep saying that again and again, but it's something that fascinates me. The idea of secondary effects.
Yeah.
So a secondary effect is a thing that you don't anticipate would happen as a result of a change. Well, Walmart is a secondary effect. You wouldn't have had Walmart unless automobiles and large roads had been created.
Yeah.
There'd be no need for Walmart. Walmart is a secondary effect of the popularization of the automobile. That's period. There's no need for it otherwise. So imagine big box stores. What do we need? Are big box stores still going to exist? I don't know. There's all kinds of things like that I don't think we can really anticipate.
Yeah. Yeah, well said. Well, hey, I want to wrap up the conversation with just two more topics. People can't imagine, right? We were just talking on that subject. I wanted to ask you, do you think this is another layer of maybe some people can't accept or might have trouble accepting? And I want to back up and say this is born out of, I remember, or I recall, it's funny, last time we spoke, we talked about Jimmy Carter in a different context, but I recall that Jimmy Carter suggested, I believe it was Jimmy Carter, that like maybe instead of turning the heat up during the winter, that people could just put on a sweater.
Wear
and
a
Americans
sweater.
were like, I'll be goddamned if I do
Right.
that.
Right. The famous. Well, I think it was less that I'll be goddamn if I wear a sweater, and it was more, how is it that Jimmy Carter is allowing these OPEC nations to push us around? And I think that people were really angry about being pushed around.
Yeah.
And I think the big difference that we have here is that there is no person. This is physics. This is nature that's changing. So, you can't say, well, we're going to go punch nature's nose and make them stop. This is a inexorable tide. When the tide starts coming in, you can't stand there and yell at it. It's not going to stop. It's going to keep coming.
But do you get the base, like maybe some of these unforeseen changes that we've been talking about during the episode, it might cause a little bit of a discomfort, and maybe people should prep for that?
My in-laws live in Kentucky, and when I go to Kentucky, everyone drives a double wide, and the license plates, they have these special license plates that say "Friend of Coal, Kentucky," and coal used to be a major way of life. It's not really anymore. Most of the coal jobs are gone. A lot of people remember it and they hold on to it like good times because jobs paid well, even though lots of people got black lung disease and lots of people got really hurt. So there are good memories of having a good income and living well. And that's a change. And I'm not sure that everyone wants to live that change. It's hard to imagine how your life could be different when you don't really know what it could be like.
Unknown.
Yeah, and I have a son who is just starting high school. He's doing great now, but before he went to high school, it was hard for him to imagine how good it could be. And, when you're in 8th grade and you think about what that world is going to be, it can be scary. Maybe some people who've done it before you, and so then it's not so scary. Maybe you have an older sibling and they're having a great time. You think it's going to be awesome. But my son didn't. And, I think there was a lot of anticipation. Now that he's there, it's great. But I think that's a lot of what life is like. It's hard to imagine how to get excited about a thing that you just don't know anything about. And that's a large part of our world.
Well said. Well said. Well, Mike, it was a pleasure speaking to you about these topics, and I want to have more of these conversations with you. Maybe you can be our recurring climate beat person on the Coal Memo or something. Before we leave, what are you hopeful for? I want to make sure that this didn't seem like too negative of an episode. Do you have any positive notes to end on?
Well, first, I'm hopeful that everyone's going to contribute to my Kickstarter. So go to gettingwarmer.co, and that'll link you directly to the Kickstarter page, gettingwarmer.co. And if you contribute to the Kickstarter, you get part of all the things that are going on and regular reports from me starting in November. I think that we are going to make these changes. And I think that what we're going to end up with is a place that's cleaner, healthier to live in, and probably more enjoyable. I've noticed that having EV cars around is nicer than loud cars that are, spewing stuff. I have a lot of hope and excitement for less expensive stuff. I think that, as we move to renewables, that's a lot less expensive than coal and natural gas. I think that we could have a less expensive lifestyle. And I think that, ultimately this is going to require a lot of us to pull together in a way that we hadn't thought about before. So I'm hopeful that in 20, 30 years, the world is maybe a closer, more tight-knit place. We now have a common enemy. And the common enemy is the destruction of our planet as we know it. So, maybe like in Independence Day, Bill Pullman will stand on top of a car and give a speech and we'll all get excited and start fixing the world. That'd be great. Yeah. This is our Independence Day.
Yeah. Here's to hoping, folks.
Yeah, right.
Folks, I hope you found as much value in this conversation as I did. All of the links that we mentioned in this episode will be in the podcast description. So if it's easier for you to just click and go and support the Kickstarter campaign, then by all means go that route. So, Mike, did you have fun today? It's a different conversation. Different conversation than we normally have, right?
Yeah, no, that's fine. That's fine with me. I had a great time.
I'm looking forward to more of these. Like I say, I think it'd be cool to continue these talks, maybe after you return in November. I have faith that we're going to be sending you out there, and I'll do my part to share the Kickstarter campaign.
Thank you. I appreciate it. That's terrific. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and folks, join me. I contributed to the Kickstarter campaign. Let's send
That's
Mike
right, you
out
did.
there.
That's right. Thank
yeah.
you. Thank you, Cole. I really appreciate it. It's good to have your support.
Absolutely. Well, again, folks, hope you found as much value in this conversation as I did. Mike, thank you so much.
Thank you, Cole. Great talking to you.